Well, it's a real pleasure to have Tom join us. Tom's a longtime friend. He's been a member of Parliament since 2015, and he earned that seat the hard way by doing his candidacy through a primary, Conservative Party primary, and he's been twice selected by his colleagues as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Parliament. Tom is a reserve officer in the British Army, having served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Before running for Parliament, Tom also served as the principal military assistant to the Chief of the Defense Staff. As a civilian, Tom has worked as a journalist and a management consultant. He has a divinity degree, speaks Arabic, and while in Afghanistan, worked in Pashto and Dari. As you can tell from this short introduction, Tom is an individual with many talents and is dedicated to public service. Indeed, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that in anticipation of the UK leaving the EU, Tom married a French jurist working to rebuild ties between London and the continent, one child at a time. Tom, welcome.
Thanks, Gary. It's great to see you again. Oh, very nice to see you too.
Let me start off with sort of a broad question. It's been 2 months since the government produced the integrated review, which has a sweeping agenda. In conversations and discussions with your colleagues and others, both in and out of government, I'd be curious to see how you think what the integrated review got right and what you think perhaps they came up short on. So if we could just start there and begin the conversation. Thanks.
Sure, that's a short, simple question, which doesn't cover very much. Look, it got a few things. My job as the chair of the committee is to criticize the government, so you'll forgive me if I'm not always full of praise, but it did get a few things right. It got the focus on science and technology right. It got the tilt to the Asia-Pacific, to the Indo-Pacific right. It got the emphasis on new commercial links right. And in many ways, it really is actually, if we're honest, an integrated review all about China. I mean, it's actually quite cautious about mentioning China, but you don't have to read very far between the lines to see that's what it's all about. But the bits it got wrong, well, maybe that's overstating it. The bits it left out, perhaps, is a better way of putting it. Africa, barely touched on. Our relationship with the European Union and indeed with European partners, not really that detailed. And actually many areas of increasing importance like South America, not really brought in. So I think there are gaps, but I have to say the emphasis on India, the emphasis on Southeast Asia and the focus on China, I think are all welcome.
Well, speaking of China, congratulations, you've been sanctioned by the government. So I worked 25 years to try to get sanctioned and it failed. So I mean, you've accomplished this in a very short time.
That and a haircut, Gary, are the two things I have over you.
Yes, that's true. Look, one of the things you did was you helped start this, took a leading hand in starting the China Research Group. I'd be curious if you explain why you think that was necessary at the time you did, and what kind of gap you think you were filling that you thought that needed to be filled.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, when we started about a year and a half, 2 years ago, no, about a year ago, something like that, Neil O'Brien and I were talking to colleagues, and if you asked them who the foreign minister of France was or the foreign minister of the United States was, you'd have a pretty good chance of getting the correct answer. I mean, you might not, but you'd have a pretty good chance of getting the correct answer. If you asked the same question about China, in fact, if you asked any question about China, you'd have a pretty good chance of getting a blank stare back. And whatever your position on China, whatever your views on human rights or trade or any number of different questions, not to know anything about a country that now makes up about 13% of the economy and 25% of the demography of the world is a bit of a failing for British parliamentarians. And so we set it up really in order to help inform ourselves and others as to what's going on in China. And we've held many online meetings. In fact, funnily enough, COVID has been good for us in that sense because we've held many online meetings, been able to get very interesting speakers. to attend, and we've had individuals attending, watching from around the world. So it's been a very revealing time, and I think it's incredibly important. In fact, it's only getting more important as the days go by. And it's not just parliamentarians, of course; it's also journalists and other opinion formers. So having this level of awareness grow is really absolutely fundamental to having a proper ability to respond to what we're seeing as a major change in the global situation.
Gary, could I come in on this point? I'm curious to ask a little bit more about China, because from the outside, you can't help but be struck by a pretty dramatic change in tone in British policy toward China over the past few years. And so you don't have to go back that far to find UK prime ministers talking about the coming golden age of relations with China. It was only a couple of years ago where there were some pretty serious concerns expressed in the United States about 5G decisions and technological dependence and that sort of thing. And if you fast forward to the present, obviously China is front and center in this review. The UK government has been a leading proponent of the idea of a D10 to try to push back on Chinese technological influence. Where do you think there has been significant progress, in your view, on UK policy toward China over the past few years, and where are there potentially areas where there is still ground to cover?
Right. So look, I mean, when I started raising issues about this in 2016, 2017, it was quite clear that I was considered deeply unhelpful, somewhat unpatriotic, and very, very damaging to the UK economy, and shutting up would be a wise decision. It's quite noticeable that going from being a solo voice in 2016 to a mainstream voice only 5 years later, I'd love to claim it as my own success, but actually it's down to many other things too. President Trump helped in clarifying the choices available to us. And then, of course, the Chinese government helped itself when it started to do wolf warrior diplomacy, which clarified the choices, not just for us, actually, but for many countries around the world, particularly amongst our European partners and friends. So I think those were the big changes that happened. But I have to say, when I started to question the golden era, it was a pretty solo sport. It's now become much more of a team game. There are many challenges still remaining, though, and the Prime Minister himself describes himself as a Sinophile, which I mean, we all are at a base level. The problem is that China isn't ruled by the Chinese; it's ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, which is a very different organization to the Chinese people. And so we find ourselves in a position where to be Sinophile may be important, but it's not always relevant, because it is them you're dealing with. So the challenge we've got is, how do we deal with Beijing as it is, not as we wish it were? And here is where I think we've got to wake up to some really tough choices. And they're about standard setting and investing into a future that is going to be governed by whoever moves first. So whether you're looking at things like the UN agency, the International Telecoms Union, which is, as you know, about 150 odd years old, but is now governed by a Chinese director general who is trying to replace things like ICANN, the Internet Domain Name Setting organization, with this sort of UN body that does it more centrally. Or whether you're looking at the way in which Huawei is at the moment feeding off the 5G standards formed by many others, but is beginning already to set the 6G standards, and is probably already setting the 7G standards that will form the future choices that we'll make in communications. We're seeing a very different world arising. And just as the United Kingdom, the laws of England and Wales, really, and then the United States, Australia, the European Union, others, set the cultural situation into which global trade grew over the last 70, 80 years by writing the rules, effectively encoding in a Latin script and an English language what the norms and standards of ownership, of property, of privacy, of individual rights were into global trade. The next generation of global trade is being encoded in binary, in noughts and ones, by programmers in Shenzhen. And if you don't believe that the culture is different, have a look at the difference between Chinese AI and West Coast AI. They're very different. They're already very different. And that's without having a deliberate policy to impose it. That's simply because the cultural background of the programmers is so different.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to be thought about, I suppose, is, there's more of a consensus about China, certainly in the United States over the last few years. And there's, as you suggest, there's a growing one in the UK. One wonders, though, in the absence of cooperation with Berlin and Paris on China, just how much progress one can make in the kind of standard setting competition that you've been talking about. And I guess the obvious question is, how does London, sort of make that connection between Paris and Berlin and Washington, absent not being in Brussels?
So I think that's a fair question, and it's a challenge that we've all got. But by the way, it's not just Paris, Berlin; it's also Tokyo and Delhi. That if we are going to have a standard that is global and actually works, as in rolls out and understands, works with the values and works with the norms of our various different cultures, it needs to include all of those. And I think the way we need to think about it is the way that our ancestors thought about the GATT agreements, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, in the late 1940s. When they were pulling together the norms of international trade, they knew what they were doing. They weren't just trying to come up with different forms of, exchanging coal and iron or around the European Union or rather around the world. What they were actually trying to do was set up a system that defended the economic interests of countries that were based on the rule of law and democracy against an encroaching Soviet threat. They realized that Comintern, or its successor by that point, was effectively swallowing up countries like Czechoslovakia by slowly changing the economic dependence that they had on their neighboring states and bringing them into a different orbit. And so GATT wasn't an economic project, if you like. It was a political project that was underpinned by economics. And we need to remember that when we're talking about technological projects today, we're actually talking about political projects underpinned by technology. And so depending on how we look at it will be really important. So look, here's a quick example. Do you use Alipay or Stripe? Well, I mean, they're both payment systems, right? I mean, they're both, in theory, roughly equivalent, aren't they? Well, they're not. One of them feeds your data into a totalitarian dictatorship that has different ideas on privacy and ownership and innovation and networks than anybody in a democratic and law-abiding state. And the other enables those networks and that innovation, that free market, by actually underpinning it. So, even a very simple choice that appears to be an equivalency is not an equivalency. It's a decision on what kind of a world you're trying to build. So buy Stripe is what I'd say.
So I just maybe follow up with a question building on Gary's. And so as you noted, one of the areas of relatively little emphasis in the report is the future of the relationship with Europe, and particularly with the EU. Obviously, we've seen just in recent weeks some flare-ups of tension across the channel. What do you think is sort of the proper trajectory of UK-EU relations in the future? And then what are some of the dangers or uncertainties that would need to be guarded against?
So the proper future of the relationship is for both sides to recognize that though we are no longer in the same trade bloc, we are still essential partners. One of the most important intelligence partners of the United Kingdom is Germany. One of the most important defense partners of the United Kingdom is France. The single non-discretionary foreign relationship we've got is with the Republic of Ireland. It's our only land border. These are not optional alliances. This isn't just about, food and farming or, the movement of students. This is absolutely fundamental to Britain's protection. And in fact, if you go further, the real strength that the United Kingdom has now got is that we have strategic depth, quite difficult to achieve when you're an island and a small island off the coast of Europe. But we now have strategic depth of some 2,000 miles. Because our border is the eastern border of Estonia and Poland and Bulgaria, not the Straits of Dover. Now, that's a hell of a strategic achievement by the United Kingdom over the last 70 years. And it's incrementally, don't forget, in 1945, or rather, let me rephrase that, in 1944, our border was the southern coast of England. Over the last 70, 80 years, we've pushed it south and east by thousands of miles, giving ourselves the strategic depth to be able to be confident in our own protection and certain of our future. Now, that's a huge achievement by politicians over the last 80 years. We've got to make sure we keep it. And the way you keep it is by remaining friends with your partners and making sure that you don't undermine them. And that's why we need to make sure we invest strongly in NATO, make sure we keep, as the saying goes, the Americans in and the Russians out. The Germans down is less of an issue these days, but the first two still matter. And we need to make sure we keep partnerships going on defense and everything else with others. But the reality is we also need a trading relationship. Look, we do half our trade, about 45% of our trade with the European Union, and a lot of it in services, which is not that easy to replace with countries around the world, because it depends on an understanding of norms that you don't always share. So it is important that we maintain a service relationship and trading relationship with our European partners. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be able to do it, because the reality is we do actually rely on each other. So I hope very much that over the next few months and years, we will realize that we are now divorced, that it's time to start, phoning each other and reminding each other whose turn it is to pick up the kids for the weekend. And with any luck, get to the joint barbecue stage sometime in the next year or two, so that by the time the kids are 18, we can attend their weddings, or their graduations rather, without throwing ham sandwiches at each other. So, I think it's possible, by the way. I think it's eminently possible, because we have so many shared interests. And it's certainly, when you look at things like the relationship over Ireland, that it's absolutely fundamental. I mean, the reality is that the island of Ireland is a shared entity between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. And we must discuss together how we share the commitments and the responsibilities that we have.
Well, speaking of Ireland, how do you think the current government is dealing with the issue of the border, Northern Ireland and Ireland? I mean, do they have a real plan for smoothing out what obviously are the sort of rough edges right now? Sorry.
I'll give you the good news. The good news is one of my buddies from Afghan days has just become the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, the smaller of the two unionist parties in Ireland. He's a great guy. He's called Doug Beattie, and he won his military cross, sort of a Silver Star equivalent or something like that, in combat in Afghanistan. Clearly, I was overlooked, but that must have been because I was cowering in the dust while he was actually doing the fighting. But he's a great guy and a very, very impressive individual. So I hope what we're going to see is a growing sense of unionist confidence that sees itself able to, as Peter Robinson, the former leader of the DUP, put it, look for converts out of the population of Northern Ireland, because I think that would transform quite a lot of the conversation. The problem we've got at the moment, as you may know, is that the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was fundamental, absolutely fundamental to the agreement that the British government made, is now being condemned by the British government. Which is tricky, because it's literally, that was the deal, right? And so we've got to find ways to make it work better. The truth is, however, it doesn't. The Northern Ireland Protocol doesn't work very well for the people of Northern Ireland. It wasn't a very good deal. It was an expedient moment when we needed to get various things over the line. We've got them over the line. Now we need to find a more sustainable agreement that endures. And so we do need to have conversations, mostly with the Republic of Ireland and with the Taoiseach Micheál Martin, but also with our European partners. But I think that, this is one of those areas where the UK and the Republic of Ireland are very much on the same side, and we need to find a way that works and works with our European partners.
So maybe I could pick up on this. The report, you're struck in reading it by the fact that it continues to put the relationship between the UK and the US obviously at the center of British strategy, which, great news from an American perspective. But there are clearly certain points of friction in the relationship, as there always are. The future of the Good Friday Agreement being one of them, given that President Biden is clearly very invested in it. There's also, I think, kind of the question of diverging priorities. And so the report does put emphasis on a more competitive relationship with China, but it's very clear that the primary threat to UK security, on a state basis anyways, is Russia, at a time when America's primary threat is China. And so I wonder if you could talk through a little bit about how the UK should approach the special relationship at a time where there's still lots of shared interests, obviously, but there are also certain points of friction in certain areas where the countries may be focused on different things.
Yeah, I would just add just one other little perhaps difference is how Washington is thinking about trade relations these days. I mean, global Britain really does depend upon a kind of open trading system, and I think both Republicans and Democratic administrations have headed in the opposite direction.
Yeah, look, I think the biggest challenge is Gary's point, actually, that it's an increasingly, or at least the appearance of an increasingly protectionist United States. That's the biggest challenge for the UK. The reality is, I would argue that the Good Friday Agreement and President Biden's emphasis on it is really good news for the people of the United Kingdom. Look, when I was going to school as a young boy in London, regularly the underground, the tube trains were cancelled because a bomb had been laid on the underground. I remember, being bundled. Very aggressively bundled by the police into a shop as a bomb went off outdoors. This was, my young life in London was spent with a very conscious awareness of the threat of IRA violence in England and in other parts of the UK. So, the idea that the GFA, the Good Friday Accord was just a solution for Ulster and for the people of Northern Ireland is not true. It was a solution for the whole of the United Kingdom. And one of the reasons why many of us are absolutely wedded to that agreement and very, very pleased that the Biden administration and President Biden himself has consistently taken such a strong line on it is because I see it as having brought peace not just to Northern Ireland, but to the whole of the United Kingdom, particularly to London. I mean, not very far away from the community I represent in Kent, in Deal, a little way away. A whole bunch of Royal Marines bandsmen were murdered by the IRA when a bomb went off there. So, this isn't not just even about London. It's about the whole of the UK. So I have to say, I think that's an important issue. But I do think your point is valid, which is that our interests are connected, but they're not identical. My own argument is that the Russia emphasis was possibly a little bit, was a bit more transient. So I'm not saying the integrated review is wrong, but the reality is we're looking at an increasingly aggressive Russia as an increasingly enfeebled President Putin does what old kings do, fears the rise of young princes, and therefore seeks to export nationalism so that people look abroad for war and glory rather than looking at his own throne. I mean, you don't have to read much of Shakespeare to realize this is not a new story and is pretty consistent. And so what he's doing, I mean, it's a pretty old pattern. I mean, you can look at the worst example, of course, is King Lear, but there are plenty of others. And President Putin is just following an old script. But the reality is Russia is a broken and destroyed country, robbed blind by the current mafia gang that calls itself a government. And so although, yes, it is violent, it isn't strategically dangerous, whereas China is a strategic threat in the sense that it's trying to rewrite the global standards and orders in a way that is, I think, not conducive to free and democratic peoples like ours.
Before we leave China, I did want to sort of ask a question or two about Hong Kong. I mean, the UK it signed a treaty with Beijing back in the mid '80s that was supposed to create a civic space for Hong Kong. Obviously, over the last couple of years, Beijing has decided to turn its back on the agreement. It's not clear what can be done, but I'm curious. I mean, there are, I think the figure is over 5 million Hong Kong citizens who have these not quasi-official, they're official passports that will allow them to move to the UK. I think the estimate is about 300,000 might take advantage of that. I wonder if that's an underestimate as things get worse there. But I guess my question is, what's to be done?
So in 2017, I wrote for, I know your favorite magazine, The Atlantic, about getting...
No wonder I missed it.
Getting exactly. I was keeping it from you, Gary. The getting British nationals overseas, which is the status afforded to Hong Kong citizens on the departure of the UK from the then colony of Hong Kong, to give them the right to reside in the UK. I think we did them a wrong in 1984 in the Sino-British Joint Declaration by stripping them of their right to reside in the UK. I think that was an error then, and I'm very glad that the current Home Secretary has corrected that error, a former member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So there you go. There's us having some influence over British policy. And she's done the right thing. The reason she has done the right thing is because you're right. Look, we're not going to send a gunboat into the Fragrant Harbour, right? We're not going to retake the new territories. That's not how this is going to work. But the idea that there is anything to retake if the Beijing state destroys the infrastructure, the operating system that allowed Hong Kong to prosper is rubbish. There's nothing there. It's not, people aren't in Hong Kong because it's built on gold. They're in Hong Kong because it's built on law. And because it's built on law, the people who've been able to work hard and be entrepreneurial and innovate have prospered. So what I think we need to do is welcome those who wish to come to the UK. By the way, a lot of them are going to Vancouver, a lot are going to Australia, to New Zealand, and I'm sure many will look to go to the United States, to make sure that we replicate the operating systems into which they were able to inject their talents, so that we see that prosperity coming to those countries they migrate to. And now, personally, I will be extremely welcoming of Hong Kongers who are coming to the UK, and Hong Kongers who wish to move to Tunbridge in Kent. You are very welcome. Bring your ideas, bring your entrepreneurial efforts, bring your vision, and I'm sure that you will be as at home as British nationals in Britain as you were as British nationals overseas.
Could I, before we pivot away from the Indo-Pacific, maybe I could ask a question about one more hotspot being Taiwan. And so obviously the temperature has risen pretty dramatically there. But one of the positive developments is that you're seeing more countries beyond the United States and even beyond the Indo-Pacific start thinking about the defense of Taiwan as something that they might have an interest in as well. And so I'm curious if you might say something about how your government should approach that, given that the danger of some sort of crisis seems to be ratcheting up, and even short of that, given that preserving sort of a democratic Taiwan in the coming years seems to be increasingly vital, but also increasingly difficult.
Right. So we've just sent Her Majesty's ship, the Queen Elizabeth, and a carrier battle group out to the South China Seas, and it's going to go round all the way to Okinawa. I think this is great, and it's got US Marine Corps F-35s on it, demonstrating interoperability. And I'm very pleased. I was in conversation with the Japanese defense minister not very long ago, and we were talking about having Japanese F-35s flying off her flight deck as well. And all that's great. I'm delighted that we're doing it. But as everybody knows, the key to military engagement is not visiting, but persistence. You got to be there and stay there. Otherwise, there's a danger that you don't demonstrate strength, but you just demonstrate transience. And transience is just another word for weakness. And so it's important that we maintain a capability to deploy force into those areas. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it should always be a carrier battle group, but we do need to have a permanent maritime presence. And this is where we need to work with our European partners. Germany has got a frigate out there. The French, as you know, have got bases in New Caledonia. We've got partners, very close partners in the Royal Australian Navy, and of course the Japanese Navy, and of course the US Navy. So finding ways in which we can maintain a presence is essential, because what we're seeing in Taiwan is really interesting. We're seeing several different levels of challenge. I think is probably the best way of putting it at this stage. We're seeing an economic challenge. We're seeing an attempt by Beijing to lure Taiwanese entrepreneurs to the mainland in various different ways through various tax deals and all the rest of it. We're seeing probably another economic challenge in the way that we think various companies in Shenzhen and elsewhere are buying up semiconductors at the moment in order to stockpile them, hence a reduction in the availability of TSMC products. But we're also seeing an increasing belligerence by the Chinese armed forces, by the PLA in its various different guises. Now, the real threat from all of this is actually not the military one. We all know that if the PLA were to land troops on Taiwan, anybody who's fought in the mountains would know that the PLA would be pinned down for months, maybe even years. Even if they were to end up victorious, the cost would be extremely high. And for a regime that depends on rather more popularity than it appears to manage right now, that could easily bring down the Communist Party in China, and they know it. They don't really want to try it. What they're trying to do is to win a battle without war. Now, that's where our real challenge lies. So making sure that we demonstrate commitment is not just about protecting Taiwan, but it's also about demonstrating to countries in the region, Indonesia's and Philippines and many others, that actually you don't need to do the deal with Beijing. You can stick to your existing deal with free countries. You can defend your people and their interests and maintain your economic growth without handing over your security to a country you know is looking to control and change the way you operate. So I think that our military presence, although of course it's about Taiwan, is not directly about Taiwan. It's actually much more about shaping the freedom of the entire region.
To put you really on the spot, would the UK ever want or be willing to sell defense equipment to Taiwan?
I can't see it today, but I think that's an error. I think that the UK should be willing to sell defense equipment to all democratic states.
Fair. Speaking of defense equipment, after the integrated review came out, of course, the Defense Ministry put out its own white paper talking about the military needed to carry out the integrated review. There's a lot of emphasis on technology, beefing up Air Force effort, shipbuilding. And one of the more notable things, of course, is the land forces, the Army has been cut to levels. I can't remember when the British Army was so small. But they did it right. I mean, is this the right? Well, there's two questions. Did they get it right in general? Second thing is there's a plus up in obviously defense spending to try to bring some of these things forward. The question a lot of people ask is, given how much modernization is being planned, whether or not even that bump up in resources is going to be sufficient.
So, let's look at what the increase was. The increase is £6 billion a year over 4 years. And that basically gets swallowed up in our new deterrent program for submarines, right? And, nuclear boats are expensive things. They are quite literally the most complicated piece of equipment man has ever made. From subsurface to space technology, nothing quite equals a deterrent boat for complexity. So they're pricey, right? And a lot of the money that's going in is basically going in to fill a black hole in equipment technology. That doesn't mean that there isn't something there for everyone. There is, the emphasis on drone technology, the emphasis on new advanced warfare systems is, of course, welcome. But as I said earlier, persistence matters in war. The ability to be there, to actually hold ground, to engage, to build alliances and to train partners, that matters. And so I have to say I am concerned by the cuts in the size to the Army. And I am concerned that the number of naval personnel hasn't increased. I would like to see not just more technological platforms, but more platforms full stop. Because I think that a greater number of smaller ships and a greater number of independent commands, whether land or sea, is an important step forward in making sure we can build up partnerships around the world. And I think there's an awful lot of real estate out there that is contested, or that partners are looking for alliances over. And I think that it's something that we can offer. It's also an area of the budget that actually is very popular in the UK, unusually. And so it is an area where I would very much welcome the government actually spending a bit more.
Yeah. Well, there is this problem, which is that, buying the platforms is one thing, and sustaining them and making sure that you've got, the capability to keep them up in the air or in the sea, or, or that the ground forces actually have sufficient amount of munitions to last more than a couple of days, often gets overlooked. I think your former boss, General Ricketts, was trying to make that point after the defense paper came out.
Yeah, General Richards made the point after Libya, actually, in whenever that was, 2011, that although we had many capabilities, one of the things we were very short of back then was supply. So we'd drop a couple of targeted munitions, only to find out that we had to wait a week for the US to ship over a couple more. I'm slightly exaggerating, but it was it's making sure you have stocks is important. Just in time delivery in combat is it's a high risk game.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned it, Tom, maybe I could follow up on the nukes piece of this. And so one of the pieces of the review in the white paper that got some attention was basically the increase in the number of warheads in the UK arsenal from, I think, the previous target, which was lower than the actual stockpile, is about 180, and now I think it's around 256 or something like that. And so, could you maybe just talk us through kind of the background of this change, and then what role?
It's a bureaucratic. I'm afraid it's a maximum number of deployed warheads, which frankly we should never have published these figures in the past, and I'm very glad the government has changed the rules and it will no longer be publishing these figures. But we've gone from having a maximum of 2 boats out to having a maximum of 3 boats out, because as we're upgrading the defense system, of course, you don't want to have 1 boat back before you've got the new boat out. Otherwise, you don't have continuous at-sea deterrence. And so you've got to permanently maintain that maximum of 2 boats out, and now we're going to a maximum of 3 boats out, because we're trying to make sure the sea trials of the new deterrent boats work. And so it's really rather more bureaucratic than real, I'm afraid.
So there's no change in the underlying thinking about what sort of threats are being responded to, or how nuclear weapons are being used as a tool of deterrence.
No, there is an element in the integrated review which does talk about the deployment of nuclear weapons in response to various threats. But the fundamental doctrine doesn't appear to have changed.
Yeah. Well, one of the topics that's very much on minds these days here is, of course, the pullout from Afghanistan, the decision to be gone by 9/11. Putting aside the PR disaster of picking 9/11 as the date that you're finally out of Afghanistan. I mean, you spent a considerable amount of time in Afghanistan, particularly in Helmand. What do you think the prospects are for the government in Afghanistan being able to maintain itself in the absence of, the United States and its coalition partners?
Well, I have to say, personally, I think it was unfortunate to decide to leave. Effectively, combat operations had ended well over a year ago. In fact, to a large extent, well over 2 years ago. And the position of US forces, of whom there was about 2,000 to 3,000, and indeed the other 7,000 NATO forces, of whom about 700 were British, was really, or rather should really have been seen as more of a garrison operation, similar to our presence in Germany from 1945 through to 1990, in the sense that we were there to sustain and support the local armed forces and to make sure that it didn't fall under the sphere of influence of another power. But, now that we've made the decision, I'm afraid we should leave as quickly as possible, because we've just advertised that we've neutered ourselves. So, getting out quick is now the only thing to do. I think it's, as I say, I think it's a mistake, but the Afghan armed forces are skilled. They are certainly well trained, but the challenge they have, like many other armed forces in the region, is logistics and the dependability of legitimate authority in the center. Now, that's really hard to achieve, and we've seen only in recent days, the murder of another group of schoolgirls in Kabul. We've seen, bombings in Ghazni. We've seen any number of different attacks, which are effectively attacks on the integrity of the Afghan government, undermining the possibility or the chances of the government surviving as long as we all want it to, which is, long into the future. So I have to say I am concerned about it. And I hope very much that I'm wrong and that President Ghani demonstrates his capabilities. But it is a difficult country to govern, as anybody who's been there will tell you. And it is hard to see how the Afghan government will manage these next few years. It might, but it's going to be really tough.
Has there been much public opinion that, yes, we had to get out? I mean, it's really quite striking somewhat, or I think quite striking in the U.S. I mean, it's really not a topic at the top of public opinion that, we have to get out. I mean, it's only when politicians say we have to get out that it becomes a topic.
I have to say, most people in the UK, I think, thought we'd left years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there was a particular interest, if you see what I mean.
Either way.
Yeah.
I would just ask a follow-up question on this, which is, in the wake of the withdrawal, one of the big questions is whether the U.S. and presumably some partners can have a sufficiently robust counterterrorism posture without having the on-the-ground presence in Afghanistan. From your judgment, is that something that's possible, or is that a pipe dream?
I mean, it's difficult. Your nearest permanent base is going to be Diego Garcia. I mean, that's a hell of a helicopter ride. In fact, you're well out of range of helicopters. You've got to fly over Iran, Pakistan, or base yourself out of one of the stans in order to operate within. Or alternatively, you've got to have some sort of forward operating base inside Afghanistan. I'm not saying you can't do that, but the moment you do that, you've got to get the fuel from somewhere. You've got to get the medical support from somewhere, and you're immediately back up to 2,000 people. So I just find it difficult to see how you maintain that an enduring capability. I mean, it's just difficult. I mean, you can do it a bit, but it's really difficult.
Yep. So while we're in the area, I suppose we should talk a bit about Iran. The Biden administration has made it clear that they would like to get back to the agreement. They obviously have a difficulty, which is in the wake of the previous agreement, the Obama administration was able to reach an accord with the help of, the UK, France, Germany, and Russia and China. Things went kind of backwards in the Middle East. And so the question is getting back to the agreement sufficient, or in your opinion and the government's opinion, does a new agreement have to be broader and more pervasive?
So my own view is that a new agreement would have to be broader. The reality is that nuclear technology is, of course, absolutely essential to keep out of the hands of a millenarian cult of theocrats. But it's more than that. The missile technology, the funding of terrorism in the region.
Were you talking about the Vatican, or no? Sorry.
I'm going to pretend that you didn't know I'm Catholic. No, look, it's what we're seeing out of Tehran hasn't fundamentally changed in a number of years. We're still seeing a regime that inspires terror, sponsors terror, and uses its wealth to bring death to people across the region. The however many 100,000 it is of Sunni Muslims killed in Syria in these last few years. An absolute tragedy of one of the great countries of the world, one of the great civilizations of the world, to see it so destroyed, is that it was funded by monies released in order to enable the JCPOA. So let's not pretend that JCPOA had no downside. It had a downside, and many hundreds of thousands of people have paid for it. So if we are going to do deals, we need to make sure we're getting something, really worth it. Now, I'm not saying getting nuclear, less nuclear proliferation isn't important. It's absolutely essential. But it's also essential that we don't see conventional mayhem being generated by it either.
So there's a question that came in that I'd like to read. So has the pandemic...
Your
mic has gone really strange again. Sorry.
Oh.
Maybe I can read it out while Darius picks up. So the question is, has the COVID pandemic impacted the UK's future participation in global organizations, with vaccine disputes occurring between AstraZeneca and EU governments, the Chinese influencing the WHO, and so on, revealing strains in the existing system?
Look, I mean, I think it's changed everything for everybody, really. I mean, I wouldn't just say it's changed life for the UK, but I hope it has. I mean, I've just been going through a report that we're bringing out soon on multilateral engagement, and I can tell you as a sneak preview that I hope very much that it's going to see us engage more closely in areas like the World Health Organization. It's a mistake, I think, that some people make, and I'm afraid I think the Trump administration made it, which is, if you walk away, then you've had your effect. Well, the truth is, if you walk away from the table, then whatever advantage you thought you were getting is gone, because there's nobody truly to fight your case if you're not sitting there. And countries like the United States and the UK in multilateral organizations like the WHO are very important. The US is the biggest funder of the organization. We are the third biggest funder of the WHO, and I think I'm right in saying the Gates Foundation is the second. I think China only comes like way down, 7th, 8th, 9th. I can't remember exactly where it is, but way down. And so I think that, we need to engage with these organizations, and I think coronavirus has reminded us of that. We need to have an active policy in shaping them, and we need to remind ourselves that when Reagan and Thatcher were trying to defend the free world and change the way in which communism was seeking to influence the global environment, they fought every seat on UNESCO. They fought every seat on every UN agency, because they knew that they read the US Army Field Manual. Every day, do one thing to improve your defensive position. Well, they did. Every single day, do one thing. Make sure that you do not give ground anywhere, ever. And sadly, I think that for various different reasons, countries like ours, and indeed many others around the world, have forgotten actually that we're not just defending ourselves here. This isn't just some sort of petty tactical game to get one-upmanship over Beijing for a temporary reason. This is a fundamental fight that will shape the way in which our children and grandchildren live. If we lose, we will be living in a centralized, organized economy into which innovation will struggle and through which change will be commanded from the top. If we win, we will see the liberation of 1.3 billion Chinese people to feed an entrepreneurial market and a growing world that will see us all prosper and all benefit.
So I wonder if I might just push you a little bit more on that. And so one of the debates that I think is happening in the US right now involves this question of how to think about international institutions and international order in the wake of COVID more broadly. And one of the arguments you'll sometimes hear is that what COVID has demonstrated is that there's simply a limit to what truly global institutions can accomplish when they include actors like the CCP that may have a vested interest in those institutions not working well. And so while we shouldn't junk them, we should think about having global institutions that are then surrounded by sort of coalitions of like-minded countries that are cooperating in deeper ways. Is that the right way to think about it, the wrong way to think about it, or somewhere in between?
Hal, that's exactly the right way to think about it. And I don't know how many negotiations you've been in whether it's about the house you want to buy or whether it's the deal you want to do in Congress or in Parliament. If you walk into that last negotiation and all of you guys on the same side of the debate, it's the first time you've met, you're going to lose. You are going to lose if the first time you agree your position is in the room. You better agree at first. And that's why organizations like G7, D10, whatever it's going to be called next week, NATO and all the rest of it are so important, because these are all ways of shaping the debate. And I come back to what the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was for. It was in order to make sure that we had an agreement in place between ourselves, not to cut out the Soviet bloc. Actually, we tried, and well, the GATT people did try to engage the Soviet bloc a bit. Didn't really work, but they did try. And what we should now be doing is not pulling apart the WTO, but making sure that those of us who actually believe that the principles of the rule of law and democracy and human rights actually matter in trade, actually matter in defending jobs in the United States and in the UK, get together in advance so that we go in as a formed bloc to whatever it happens to be, the ITU or the World Trade Organization or whatever it is, because that's the only way we're gonna shape the future. Now, there is no reason to be defeatist about this, none at all. China represents about 13% of global trade. Now, will it end up being the biggest economy in the world? It might. I'm not convinced it will, but it might. But even if it does, it'll make it to about 18%. The United States, alongside the G7, alongside India, alongside Australia and South Korea, is already at 60%. The idea that the rule of law states, that the free world is under threat, it's not. The only way it's under threat is when our leaders decide that it's not worth the fight, that we're going to lose anyway, and that we should back down and compromise. We shouldn't back down. We should not compromise. We should be absolutely clear what we're standing up for, and we should be defending what are fundamental freedoms, not just because freedom itself is a natural good, which it is, but because if you want the kind of innovation that leads you to a vaccine in 6 months, if you want the kind of innovation that leads you to technological changes that we've seen in the last 10 years, and you want them to prosper and guarantee personal liberty and not state control, you need to have that freedom embedded in your system, and you need to be willing to defend it today.
Well, I actually think that's a great place to sort of wrap things up. I mean, we're a few minutes short, but that was quite the stem winder, and I enjoyed it. So why ruin it by asking about the Scottish elections or some other thing like that? I just want to really thank Tom for joining us, and this has been a great conversation, and hopefully we can do this again, but next time in person. And I suppose the big news out of the UK is the pubs are open today, so enjoy yourself.
I'd just like to advertise how much self-control it's taken not to have my first drink.
No. Given the time you're at, I'm really surprised we've lasted this long. So, but again, thank you so much, and thanks for the folks that are tuning in online for joining us. Hal, thank you as well.
Thank you. And thank you, Tom. It's great talking to you.
Thanks both very much. It's lovely to be with you again.
Take care.